Hello, and welcome to Antifragile Athletes Weekly Book Club. I'm your host, Coach Arthur Mena, known in other circles as Arthur Dane or Blood and Rain or Arthur Constantine. Um, this is our weekly book club as part of Antifragile Athletes, where we get together and read through a seminal text for our training philosophy. And of course, we're starting with our source text as a training group, Antifragile by Nassim Taleb. We are now on our second chapter. It's quite a lengthy text. So, say about the next, 20 weeks we'll be going through Antifragile. And then beyond that, we'll see. I'm joined by Antifragile athletes Jacob Arsenault and Ben Sanderson, um, or Kale Sanderson, if you will. All right, let's get straight into the text, guys. Last week was pretty eye-opening. We'll do a little share screen, and we'll get straight into it. All right. That's The Perfect and the Wicked, the wonderful book by a recent podcast guest, Tia Hudson. Okay. Let's do present. It's not letting me do it. Jacob, you're good at filling in gaps. Fill in gaps.
You'd like for me to fill in gaps?
Yeah, fill in the gaps. Say something.
What are you pulling up the book?
Yeah, I'm pulling up the book. It's not working. It's the first time I did this on stream.
Oh yeah. So, how about that weather, eh? I'm just kidding. I could just start reading, if you'd like, even though you don't have the book up.
Oh, there we are. I was saying I need to go to system preferences. Unbelievable. Is this Chrome? Is it Chrome? This is Brave browser. It's unbelievable. All right, Jacob. In the meantime, why don't you just get started with the text?
All right. So we were picking it back up on chapter 2, titled Overcompensation and Overreaction Everywhere. Let's begin. My own domain dependence was revealed to me one day as I was sitting in the office of David Halpern, a UK government advisor and policymaker. He informed me, in response to the idea of antifragility, of a phenomenon called post-traumatic growth, the opposite of post-traumatic stress syndrome, by which people harmed by past events surpass themselves. I had never heard about it before, and to my great shame, had never made the effort to think of its existence. There is a small literature, but it is not advertised outside of a narrow discipline. We hear about the more lurid post-traumatic disorder, not post-traumatic growth, in the intellectual and so-called learned vocabulary. But popular culture has an awareness of its equivalent, revealed in the expression, "it builds character." So do the ancient Mediterranean classics, along with grandmothers. Intellectuals tend to focus on negative responses from randomness, fragility, rather than the positive ones, antifragility. This is not just in psychology, it prevails across the board. How do you innovate? First, try to get in trouble. I mean serious but not terminal trouble. I hold it is beyond speculation, rather a conviction, that innovation and sophistication spark from initial situations of necessity in ways that go far beyond the satisfaction of such necessity. From the unintended side effects of, say, an intentional initial invention or attempt at invention. Naturally, there are classical thoughts on the subject, with a Latin saying that sophistication is born out of hunger, artificia docuit fames. I'm not good at Latin. The idea pervades classical literature. In Ovid, difficulty is what wakes up the genius, ingenium malus saepe movement, which translates in Brooklyn English to, when life gives you a lemon. The excess energy released from overreaction to setbacks is what innovates. This message from the ancients is vastly deeper than it seems. It contradicts modern methods and ideas of innovation and progress on many levels, as we tend to think that innovation comes from bureaucratic funding, thorough planning, or by putting people through a Harvard Business School class by one highly decorated professor of innovation and entrepreneurship. highly decorated professor of innovation and entrepreneurship are capitalized, since Arthur does not have the book shared yet, who never innovated anything, or hiring a consultant who never innovated anything. This is a fallacy. Note for now the disproportionate contribution of uneducated technicians and entrepreneurs to various technological leaps, from the Industrial Revolution to the emergence of Silicon Valley, and you will see what I mean. Yet, in spite of the visibility of the counter evidence and the wisdom you can pick up free of charge from the ancients or grandmothers, moderns try today to create inventions from situations of comfort, safety, and predictability instead of accepting the notion that necessity really is the mother of invention. Many, like the great Roman statesman Cato the Censor, looked at comfort, almost any form of comfort, as a road to waste. He did not like it when we had it too easy, as he worried about the weakening of the will. And the softening he feared was not just at the personal level. An entire society can fall ill. Consider that I am writing these lines we are living in, that as I am writing these lines we are living in a debt crisis. The world as a whole has never been richer, and it has never been more heavily in debt, living off borrowed money. The record shows that for society, the richer we become, the harder it gets to live within our means. Abundance is harder for us to handle than scarcity. Cato would have smiled hearing about the recently observed effect in aeronautics that the automation of airplanes is under challenging pilots, making flying too comfortable for them, dangerously comfortable. The dulling of the pilot's attention and skills from too little challenge is indeed causing deaths from flying accidents. Part of the problem is a Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) regulation that forced the industry to increase its reliance on automated flying. But thankfully, the same FAA finally figured out the problem. It has recently found that pilots often abdicate too much responsibility to automated systems. Any thoughts?
Thus far, yeah. It's interesting how a lot of us really don't know what to do with abundance. The first thing that comes to mind is abundance of time. When people think they have all the time in the world, they don't actually do anything. When they think they have less time, they seem to be able to pack a bunch of things into more compressed units and intervals. That's also something that he gets into. That's also that he gets something he gets into later in the book. Later in the book, he starts to talk about if you want something done fast, you actually give it to your busiest person. So I think he sort of leans into the logic rather, that if you have like an engine that's going pretty fast, then you're going to want to use that engine because it's not going to take long to sort of rev up. It's already revved up. This is also like a Jocko-ism in the sense that it's like objects that are in motion tend to stay in motion.
Yeah,
so it makes
forward
the
center
argument,
of mass.
Yeah, it's like they oftentimes think that oftentimes people think you need rest, and like something that kind of comes to mind is something that comes to mind even like for us as Christians, we're supposed to rest on Sunday, but like that alleged rest, I'm speaking in terms of any Christian, that is, anyone who celebrates any kind of a Sabbath. That Sabbath is, like, for Orthodox Christians, is pretty physical. And you're standing for an hour and a half to 3 hours in some instances. We start our day with the pre-communion prayers. It's quite daunting. There's a lot in front of you. And for many, if you're a mother or a father, you're taking care of kids. So it's like you're never really in this kind of like rest. You just kind of have different degrees of activity. Now, I know this is antithetical to what I say in terms of recovery. The only thing that we have that accelerates recovery from training physically is grounding, and then just actual legitimate rest. So not all these people, like these quote unquote gurus who don't know anything, or just really good at influencing people on social media. And they just sort of roll out yoga mats like, oh, it's my active rest day. I like to do a little bit of a run. Like, no, that's not rest, right? That being said, what's paradoxical for this is if you actually want things to get easier, you kind of do just stay in motion, like he's arguing for. Any thoughts on that, Jacob?
Yeah, definitely the staying in motion is very beneficial if you want to get somewhere fast because, you know, you're keeping the gears lubricated. You're, like Jocko says, forward center of mass. And it's not it's not as hard to keep doing the things that you're doing once you're already doing them. Once you have like a habit formed. Uh, there's a inverse, or not inverse, a weirdly backwards relationship in the energy consumption of old light bulbs, where the initial energy that's required to turn on fluorescent light bulbs is way, way higher than it is to keep that light bulb turned on. So if you just keep flipping a switch, you're going to burn up a ton of energy relative to if you just turned on the light bulb once. And then you can run that light bulb for a surprisingly long amount of time, like hours, and it still will not equal the amount of energy you used to initially turn on the light bulb.
That initial spark.
Yeah.
If you
So
start,
taking
if
that
you start,
first step, the first step is the hardest.
it certainly feels that way in the morning. 5 a.m. Wake up. I really don't want to read 28 pages of prayers. What am I doing after that? Oh, I'm reading like 40 pages. What am I doing after that? I'm jumping rope. Just that thought of even starting. Sometimes I'm like, screw this. I mean, if I'm being honest, like if anyone thinks that I'm just like powering through these things with like the best attitude at the very beginning, I'm not. But it has to be done. And honestly, the more you avoid that first step in the day, the more your day like just increasingly gets compromised.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
It cascades. This is something that I've talked about with my spiritual father a couple of times. I was like, yeah, I get up in the morning and I do my prayers, and I intend on doing some spiritually edifying reading, like the Bible or some works of the fathers. And then I just end up looking at my phone, and then I fall into that spiral. And I told him that during confession. He was like, okay, you're not going to worry about anything else besides getting up on the right foot and doing your prayers and doing your reading, and that's going to set you up for success for the rest of the day. Because when you start your day dedicated to God, everything else will fall in place.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the jump start that you need. This always goes in a theological like spin, but we always try to think about like the most important thing. So I mean, it's kind of par for the course. After that, and the next value for us, especially the AFF, is any kind of intensity or martial values. And anything beyond that is kind of, I don't say it's irrelevant, but everything sort of falls into place after that. That's when you can actually. Yeah. It's like if you take care of sort of the vitality of faith in terms of salvation, the vitality of the material world in terms of conquering something that's much harder than the rest of your day. Like if you conquer hard conditioning, like your job's probably going to be feel a hell of a lot easier. If you avoid hard conditioning, you're going to snowball, feel like crap.
Oh yeah, yeah. That was my logic when I was living alone to working out in the morning, like super early, because I was like, if I don't do this before work, I'm definitely not gonna want to do it after work. And that just made work that much easier because I'm like, okay, now I like just have to do this for a few hours and then I'm done, basically. Easy peasy.
Yeah. Definitely. Ben, any thoughts?
I would say I'm definitely the same way. Like once it's harder for me to like get started, and then once I do it, like the rest of it just becomes that much easier. I mean, I can do this like a day-to-day thing or just like in general. I mean, like day-to-day, I wake up, like some days I go to the gym before class and I have to wake up at like 5:45 and I just sit there and I'm like, I do not want to get up right now.
Mm-hmm.
But if I don't go, it's not going to get done. So
yeah,
just like on a macro scale, like starting anything new, like for me at school, like getting into the schedule for me, once I'm in it, I can ride the wave. But getting started usually takes a few days, like 2 or 3. But then like once I'm there, I'm there. Once I'm in the schedule, I'm in
Yeah.
the schedule. But getting to the schedule sucks, and I always like the first few days I have a rough time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting my ass kicked by my schedule right now. And what sucks is I keep moving, so I have to readjust my schedule each time, which I don't want to do. Right? So like I moved from Swindon like to fucking Krakow, Poland, and now I'm in Chippenham, which is a small town in the UK. And then I'm probably gonna if I can't get to Austin next month, I'm gonna have to move to Krakow again for like 3 months. So at least there'll be some kind of normalcy there, right? And then after that, like when I move to Austin, I'm like, I am not going anywhere. I'm just not. They absolutely refuse. Um, so yeah, I think I think that jump start is vital. You know, biologically too, that cortisol spike in the morning that we have um, is that cortisol spike is like actually there to help us because it's basically saying like, no, you got to move. You need to start your day, and if you don't, then you're kind of screwed. um, I don't think there's actually a worse feeling in life than than basically starting late and knowing there's like you have to either speed up really well, and if there's other people involved in your day, it probably won't happen. And if there isn't, then you're just going to have to double time just to be exhausted at the end of the day, and you have to start again and never have that happen ever again. Shall we carry on with the text, guys?
Yes. Yes. We have about 10 more pages still. So.
Yeah, let's carry on.
All right. How to win a horse race. It is said that the best horses lose when they compete with slower ones and win against better rivals. Undercompensation from the absence of a stressor, inverse hormesis, absence of challenge, degrades the best of the best. In Baudelaire's poem, the albatross's giant wings prevent him from walking. Many do better in Calculus 103 than Calculus 101. This mechanism of overcompensation hides in the most unlikely places. If tired after an intercontinental flight, go to the gym for some exertion instead of resting. How ironic. Also, it is a well-known trick that if you need something urgently done, give the task to the busiest or second busiest person in the office. Most humans manage to squander their free time, as free time makes them dysfunctional, lazy, and unmotivated. The busier they get, the more active they are on other tasks. Overcompensation, here again. I've discovered a trick when giving lectures. I've been told by conference organizers that one needs to be clear, to speak with the fake articulation of TV announcers, maybe even dance on the stage to get the attention of the crowd. Some try sending authors to speech school. The first time it was suggested to me, I walked out, resolved to change publishers on the spot. I find it better to whisper, not shout. Better to be slightly inaudible, less clear. When I was a pit trader, one of those crazy people who stand in a crowded arena shouting and screaming in a continuous auction, I learned that the noise produced by the person is inverse to the pecking order. As with mafia dons, the most powerful traders were the least audible. One should have enough self-control to make the audience work hard to listen, which causes them to switch into intellectual overdrive. This paradox of attention has been a little bit investigated. There's empirical evidence in the effect of disfluency. Mental effort moves us into higher gear, activating more vigorous and more analytical brain machinery. The management guru Peter Drucker and the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, two persons who mesmerize the crowds the most in their respective areas, were the antithesis of the polished, swanky speaker or the consonant-trained television announcer. The same or a similar mechanism of overcompensation makes us concentrate better in the presence of a modicum of background random noise, as if the act of countering such noise helps us hone our mental focus. Consider this remarkable ability humans have to filter out noise at happy hour and distinguish the signal among so many other loud conversations. So not only are we made to overcompensate, but we sometimes need the noise. Like many writers, I like to sit in cafes, working, as they say, against resistance. Consider our bedtime predilection for the rustle of tree leaves or the sound of the ocean. There are even electric contraptions that produce white noise that helps people sleep better. Now, these small distractions, like hormetic responses, act up to a point. I haven't tried it yet, but I am certain that it would be hard to write an essay on the runway of Heathrow Airport. Antifragile responses as redundancy. Something flashed when I heard post-traumatic during that London visit. It hit me right there and then that these anti-fragile hermetic responses were just a form of redundancy, and all the ideas of Mother Nature converged in my mind. It is all about redundancy. Nature likes to overinsure itself. Layers of redundancy are the central risk management property of natural systems. We humans have 2 kidneys. This may even include accountants. Extra spare parts and extra capacity in many, many things, say lungs, neural system, arterial apparatus. While human design tends to be spare and inversely redundant, so to speak, we have a historical track record of engaging in debt, which is the opposite of redundancy. 50,000 in extra cash in the bank or better under the mattress is redundancy. Owing the bank an equivalent amount, that is debt, is the opposite of redundancy. Redundancy is ambiguous because it seems like a waste if nothing unusual happens, except that something unusual happens, usually. Further, redundancy is not necessarily wussy. It can be extremely aggressive. For instance, if you have an extra inventory of, say, fertilizers in a warehouse, just to be safe, and there happens to be a shortage because of disruptions in China, you can sell the excess inventory at a huge premium. COVID transportation difficulties. Or if you have extra oil reserves, you may sell them at a large profit during a squeeze. Now it turns out the very same logic applies to overcompensation. It is just a form of redundancy. An additional head for Hydra is no different from an extra, that is, seemingly redundant, kidney for humans, and no different from the additional capacity to withstand an extra stressor. If you ingest, say, 15 milligrams of a poisonous substance, your body may prepare for 20 or more, and as a side effect, you will get stronger overall. These extra 5 milligrams of poison that you can withstand are no different from additional stockpiles of vital or necessary goods, say extra cash in the bank or more food in the basement. And to return to the drivers of innovation, the additional quantities of motivation and willpower, so to speak, stemming from setbacks can also be seen as extra capacity, no different from extra boxes of victuals. A system that overcompensates is necessarily in overshooting mode, building extra capacity and strength in anticipation of a worse outcome and in response to information about the possibility of a hazard. And of course, such extra capacity or strength may become useful by itself, opportunistically. We saw that redundancy is opportunistic, so such extra strength can be used to some benefit even in the absence of the hazard. Tell the next MBA analyst or business school professor you run into that redundancy is not defensive, is more like investment than insurance, and tell them that what they call inefficient is often very efficient. Indeed, our bodies discover probabilities in a very sophisticated manner and assess risks much better than our intellects do. To take one example, risk management professionals look at the past for information on the so-called worst-case scenario and use it to estimate future risks. This method is called stress testing. They take the worst historical recession, the worst war, the worst historical move in interest rates, or the worst point in unemployment as an exact estimate for the worst future outcome, but they never notice the following inconsistency. This so-called worst case event, when it happened, exceeded the worst case at the time. I have called this mental defect the Lucretius problem, after the Latin poetic philosopher who wrote that the fool believes that the tallest mountain in the world will be equal to the tallest one he has observed. We consider the biggest object of any kind that we have seen in our lives or hear about as the largest item that can possibly exist, and we have been doing this for millennia. In Pharaonic Egypt, which happens to be the first complete top-down nation-state managed by bureaucrats, scribes tracked the high water mark of the Nile and used it as an estimate for a future worst-case scenario. The same can be seen in the Fukushima nuclear reactor, which experienced a catastrophe failure in 2011, when a tsunami struck. It had been built to withstand the worst past historical earthquake, with the builders not imagining much worse, and not thinking that the worst past event had to be a surprise, as it set no precedent. Likewise, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Fragilista Dr. Alan Greenspan, in his apology to Congress, offered the classic, "It never happened before." Well, nature, unlike Fragilista Greenspan, prepares for what has not happened before, assuming worse harm is possible. If humans fight the last war, nature fights the next one. Your body is more imaginative about the future than you are. Consider how people train in weightlifting. The body overshoots in response to exposures and overprepares, up to the point of biological limit, of course. This is how bodies get stronger. In the aftermath of the banking crisis, I received all manner of threats, and the Wall Street Journal suggested that I stock up on bodyguards. That is a crazy thing to put in a newspaper. That is insane. I tried to tell myself, no worries, stay calm, These threats were coming from disgruntled bankers. Anyway, people get whacked first, and then you read about it in the newspapers, not the reverse sequence. But the argument did not register in my mind, and when in New York or London, I could not relax, even after chamomile tea. I started feeling paranoia in public places, scrutinizing people to ascertain that I was not being followed. I started taking the bodyguard suggestion seriously, and I found it more appealing and considerably more economical to become one, or better, to look like one. I found Lenny Cake, a trainer weighing around 280 pounds, 130 kilograms, who moonlighted as a security person. His nickname and weight both came from his predilection for cakes. Lenny Cake was the most physically intimidating person within 5 zip codes, and he was 60. So, rather than taking lessons, I watched him train. He was into the maximum lifts type of training, and swore by it, as he found it the most effective and least time-consuming. This method consisted of short episodes in the gym in which one focused solely on improving one's past maximum in a single lift, the heaviest weight one could haul, sort of the high water mark. The workout was limited to trying to exceed the mark once or twice, rather than spending time on unentertaining, time-consuming repetitions. The exercise got me into a naturalistic form of weightlifting, and one that accords with the evidence-based literature. Work on the maximum, spend the rest of the time resting and splurging on mafia-sized steaks. I've been trying to push my limit for 4 years now. It is amazing to see how something in my biology anticipates a higher level than the past maximum, until it reaches its ceiling. When I deadlift, i.e. mimic lifting a stone to waist level, using a bar with 330 pounds, then rest, I can safely expect that I will build a certain amount of additional strength as my body predicts that next time I may need to lift 335 pounds. The benefits, beyond the fading of my paranoia and my newfound calm in public places, include small unexpected conveniences. When I am harassed by limo drivers in the arrival hall at Kennedy Airport incessantly offering me a ride, I calmly tell them to fuck off, and they go away immediately. But there are severe drawbacks. Some of the readers I meet at conferences have a rough time dealing with an intellectual who has the appearance of a bodyguard. Intellectuals can be svelte or flabby and out of shape when they wear a tweed jacket, but they are not supposed to look like butchers. Something that will give the Darwinists some work, an observation made to me by the risk analyst, my favorite intellectual opponent and personal friend Aaron Brown. The term fitness itself may be quite imprecise and even ambiguous, which is why the notion of antifragility as something exceeding mere fitness can elucidate the confusion. What does fitness mean? Being exactly tuned to a given past history of a specific environment or extrapolating to an environment with stressors of higher intensity. Many seem to point at the first kind of adaptation, missing the notion of antifragility. But if one were to write down mathematically the standard model of selection, one would get overcompensation rather than mere fitness. Even the psychologists who studied the antifragile response of post-traumatic growth and show the data for it don't quite get the full concept, as they lapse when using words into the concept of resilience, quote unquote. Any thoughts? We're a little over halfway through the chapter. Got a couple of pages left. Hello?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, especially in the beginning of that sort of tirade. What's interesting is he sees redundancy as a good thing in some instances, but with things like time, he thinks that redundancy, having a surplus of time isn't actually a good thing. Redundancy of money is a good thing. Redundancy of sort of material resources is a good thing. But then you can almost like draw a different parallel that there's a redundancy and there's a surplus of tasks that need to be done, and that causes one to actually rise. So I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on why that is and why you think that's the case.
What do you mean by surplus of tasks? You mean mean like people having a lot to do, and then through that, being able to push through them, right?
Correct.
Okay. I think it's because people feel people feel the pressure, you know. There's I think Andrew Huberman talks about it in something where there's a stress curve where people perform the most efficiently and the fastest and the best when they're under a deadline, and they perform the best within some proximity to that deadline. So he says that he loves deadlines, and I do this horribly with my schoolwork. I wait until the deadline is near, and then I'm like, okay, when I get the deadline near, then I'm gonna take less time to do this assignment or homework or whatever, because it's due. It's due in like a day, and I had a week to do it, but now I only have to do it in a day because I only have a day to do it. And rarely, I don't think I've had a late assignment in years, but I just keep going through this terrible procrastinative cycle where I wait to do the things that need to be done, but it still works out because I fall within the deadline. So I think schoolwork is a bit of an isolated case where everything is nice and controlled. But when you don't know where the deadline is, actually, if it feels like you've already gotten past the deadline and it's even worse and you just need to get something done because it feels like you're going to die if you don't, then I think that's what, if people have a lot of stuff to do that appear to them necessary for survival, then they'll get it done. But if they're sitting cushy and they don't have stuff that they feel like they need to do to keep surviving, then they'll let it fall to the wayside.
I really go back and forth on it, man, honestly, because there's so many of these tenets in this book that I really believe in and sort of push. But maybe, so like for example, he was using I work in a busy cafe because you need something to press against, right? I obviously have spun a lot of rhetoric, in various writing platforms about pressing against something. You get better when you press against
I mean, you're in a cafe right now. It was starting to press against me as I was reading that because all the background noise was getting really loud. And then thankfully you muted yourself, so thank you for that.
Yeah. I figured that wouldn't necessarily be a good idea for stream, right? But
yeah.
So, I mean, there are instances where I think where I do reach a breaking point in resistance, where I can't focus anymore. I have to create silence. I have to go somewhere really, really quiet. Not to take an aside on Enneagrams, but to take a side on Enneagrams. I'm like a 5, and 5s have a thing for secrecy and solitude, which tracks, honestly. But but that also relays back to the bit in the first chapter where he says what's important is you have stressors that have an end, right? So this sort of perpetual stressor that has no end in sight, it just sort of wears you down to a point of no return. And what's interesting too is he doesn't. We can refute his training methods as well. He basically said an equivalent of like maxing out. We know the body doesn't respond to consistent maxing out. They'll eventually have a similar effect where, all right, this has been too much of a stressor, and now the body is just going to shut down and try to recover. You can't force the issue on your body unless you provide a stressor that is actually life or death. And then in that instance, people do crazy things like lift cars off of children. That has something to do with complete usage of the brain. Therefore, firing all the neurons at a max effort capacity. Maybe if I were to have a working hypothesis, that'd be the case. But yeah, it's a lot of this is very much, and this is a quote by the great Dan John, one of the greatest American strength and conditioning coaches out there. Training an athlete is an unbalanced balance, right? There's no way I can get every last thing that you can develop in one program, but I can get it in 3. That's why we treat our 8-week programs as a part of one big 6-month program. Right? That's a complete block. He makes the case here. It's like you have certain flashes of abundance. You use that abundance, so you have an abundance of fertilizer, right? You use it in a pinch, right? You sell it when there's scarcity, right? You make a profit for it. Until then, you sort of hold on to it. Another parallel is in fighting, right? So you can't. The game of fighting is make space, take space, right? If someone is sort of like, if someone is advancing into the pocket towards me, I'm gonna make space in between us, going to sort of measure out, and then I'm going to tee off on him. Right? If someone's too close, if someone has a gap between us, I'm going to take the space in front. So I'm going to close in the gap, strike, and then make space again. So it's really, he's arguing for a point of when to make the right decision, and that in itself is like a huge part of anti-fragility. He hasn't necessarily said is the case yet, but he said it indirectly pretty much the first two chapters and parts of the prologue as well. Ben, do you have any thoughts? Ben? Yes? No? Mic is broken. I'll fix it. Okay.
Darn.
Jacob, why don't we carry on with the text?
Right? All right. We'll make it an
Yep.
hour. Resuming the text. On the anti-fragility of riots. Also, could you mute your mic again, Arthur?
No, certainly.
No. Actually, no. I need something to press against. Just kidding.
Say no more, fam. Carry on.
On the anti-fragility of riots, love, and other unexpected beneficiaries of stress. Once one makes an effort to overcome domain dependence, the phenomenon of overcompensation appears ubiquitous. Those who understand bacterial resistance in the biological domain completely fail to grasp the dictum by Seneca in De Clementia about the inverse effect of punishments. He wrote, "Repeated punishment, while it crushes the hatred of a few, stirs the hatred of all, just as trees that have been trimmed throw out again countless branches. For revolutions feed on repression, growing heads faster and faster as one literally cuts off a few by killing demonstrators. There is an Irish revolutionary song that encapsulates the effect. The higher you build your barricades, the stronger we become. The crowds at some point mutate, blinded by anger and a sense of outrage, fueled by the heroism of a few willing to sacrifice their lives for the cause, although they don't quite see it as a sacrifice, and hungry for the privilege to become martyrs. It is that political movements and rebellions can be highly anti-fragile, and the sucker game is to try to repress them using brute force rather than manipulate them, give in, or find more astute ruses, as Heracles did with Hydra. If anti-fragility is what wakes up and overreacts and overcompensates to stressors and damage, then one of the most anti-fragile things you will find outside economic life is a certain brand of refractory love or hate, one that seems to overreact and overcompensate for impediments such as distance, family incompatibilities, and every conscious attempt to kill it. Literature is rife with characters trapped in a form of anti-fragile passion, seemingly against their will. In Proust's long novel La Recherche, Swann, a socially sophisticated Jewish art dealer, falls for Odette, a demi-mondaine, a kept woman of sorts, a semi or perhaps just a quarter prostitute. She treats him badly. Her elusive behavior fuels his obsession, causing him to demean himself for the reward of a bit more time with her. He exhibits overt clinginess, follows her on her trysts with other men, hiding shamelessly in staircases, which of course causes her to treat him even more elusively. Supposedly, the story was a fictionalization of Proust's own entanglement with his quoted male driver. Or take Dino Buzzati's semi-autobiographical novel Un Amore, the story of a middle-aged Milanese man who falls, accidentally of course, for a dancer at the Scala who moonlights as a prostitute. She of course mistreats him, exploits him, takes advantage of him, milks him, and the more she mistreats him, the more he exposes himself to abuse to satisfy the anti-fragile thirst of a few moments with her. But some form of happy ending there. From his biography, Buzzati himself ended up marrying at 60 a 25-year-old, Almerina, a former dancer, seemingly the character of the story. When he died shortly after that, she became a good caretaker of his literary legacy. Even when authors such as Lucretius, the same of the high mountains earlier in this chapter, rant against dependence, imprisonment, and alienation of love, treating it as a parentheses, preventable disease, they end up lying to us or themselves. Legend, perhaps, Lucretius, the priest of anti-romance, might have been himself involved in uncontrollable, anti-fragile infatuation. Like tormenting love, some thoughts are so anti-fragile that you feed them by trying to get rid of them, turning them into obsessions. Psychologists have shown the irony of the process of thought control. The more energy you put into trying to control your ideas and what you think about, the more your ideas end up controlling you. Please ban my book, The Anti-Fragility of Information. Information is anti-fragile. It feeds more on attempts to harm it than it does on efforts to promote it. For instance, many wreck their reputations merely by trying to defend it. The wily Venetians knew how to spread information by discussing it as a secret. Try it out with the following experiment in spreading gossip. Tell some a secret and qualify it in insisting that it is a secret, begging your listener not to tell anyone. The more you insist that it remain a secret, the more it will spread. We all learn early on in life that books and ideas are anti-fragile and get nourishment from attacks. To borrow from the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, one of the dour Stoic authors, fire feeds on obstacles. There is the attraction of banned books, their anti-fragility to interdicts. The first book I read during my childhood, of Graham Greene's, was The Power and the Glory, selected for no other reason than it having been put on the index, that is, banned, by the Vatican. Likewise, as a teenager, I gorged on the books of the American expatriate Henry Miller. His major book sold 1 million copies in 1 year thanks to having been banned in 23 states. The same with Madame Bovary or Lady Chatterley's Lover. Criticism for a book is a truthful, unfaked badge of attention, signaling that it is not boring, and boring is the only very bad thing for a book. Consider the Ayn Rand phenomenon. Her books, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, have been read for more than half a century by millions of people, in spite of, or most likely thanks to, brutally nasty reviews and attempts to discredit her. The first order information is the intensity. What matters is the effort the critic puts into trying to prevent others from reading the book, or more generally in life, it is the effort in badmouthing someone that matters, not so much what is said. So if you really want people to read a book, tell them it is overrated, with a sense of outrage, and use the attribute underrated for the opposite effect. Balzac recounts how actresses paid journalists, often in kind, to write favorable accounts, but the wiliest got them to write unfavorable comments, knowing that it made them more interesting. I have just bought Tom Holland's book on the rise of Islam for the sole reason that he was attacked by Glenn Bowersock, considered it to be the most prominent living scholar on the Roman Levant. Until then, I had thought that Tom Holland was just a popularizer, and I would not have taken him seriously otherwise. I didn't even attempt to read Bowersock's review, so here's a simple rule of thumb, a heuristic. To estimate the quality of research, take the caliber of the highest detractor, or the caliber of the lowest detractor whom the author answers in print, whichever is lower. Criticism itself can be anti-fragile to repression, when the vault finder wants to be attacked in return in order to get some validation. Jean Fredron, said to be a very envious thinker, with the mediocrity of envious thinkers, managed to play a role in intellectual history solely by irritating the otherwise brilliant Voltaire, to the point of bringing him to write satirical poems against him. Voltaire, himself a gadfly and expert at ticking people off to benefit from their reactions, forgot how things worked when it came to himself. Perhaps Voltaire's charm was in that he did not know how to save his wit. The same hidden anti-fragilites apply to attacks on our ideas and persons. We fear them and dislike negative publicity, but smear campaigns, if you can survive them, help enormously, conditional on the person appearing to be extremely motivated and adequately angry, just as when you hear a woman bad-mouthing another in front of a man, or vice versa. There is a visible selection bias. Why did he attack you instead of someone else? One of the millions of persons deserving but not worthy of attack. It is his energy in attacking or bad-mouthing that will, anti-fragile style, put you on the map. My great-grandfather Nicholas Gosson was a wily politician who managed to stay permanently in power and hold government positions in spite of his numerous enemies, most notably his archenemy, my great-great-grandfather on the Taleb side of the family. As my grandfather, his eldest son, was starting his administrative and hopefully political career, his father summoned him to his deathbed. "My son, I am very disappointed in you," he said. "I never hear anything wrong said about you. You have proven yourself incapable of generating envy. Get another job." As we saw with the Voltaire story, it is not possible to stamp out criticism. If it harms you, get out. It is easier to change the jobs than control your reputation or public perception. Some jobs and professions are fragile to reputational harm, something that in the age of the internet cannot possibly be controlled. These jobs aren't worth having. You do not want to control your reputation. You won't be able to do it by controlling information flow. Instead, focus on altering your exposure, say, by putting yourself in a position impervious to reputational damage, or even put yourself in a situation to benefit from the antifragility of information. In that sense, a writer is antifragile, but we will see later that most modernistic professions are usually not. I was in Milan trying to explain antifragility to Luca Formenton, my Italian publisher, with great aid from body language and hand gestures. I was there partly for the Moscato dessert wines, partly for a convention in which the other main speaker was a famous
Did you say
fragilista.
dessert? Did you say desert wines?
I said desert wines.
That's fantastic. Please carry on.
Desert wines. Moscato dessert wines. Partly for a convention in which the other main speaker was a famous fragilista economist. So, suddenly remembering that I was an author, I presented Luca with the following thought experiment. If I beat up the economist publicly, what would happen to me, other than a publicized trial causing great interest in the new notions of fragilita and antifragilita? You know, this economist had to sit what is called a tete a baf, a face that invites you to slap it, just like a cannoli invites you to bite into it. Luca thought for a second. Well, it's not like he would like me to do it, but, it wouldn't hurt book sales. Nothing I can do as an author that makes it to the front page of Corriere della Sera would be detrimental for my book. Almost no scandal would hurt an artist or writer. Now let's say I were a mid-level executive employee of some corporation listed on the London Stock Exchange, the sort who never take chances by dressing down, always wearing a suit and tie even on the beach. What would happen to me if I attacked the fragilista? My firing and arrest record would plague me forever. I would be the total victim of informational antifragility. But someone earning close to minimum wage, say a construction worker or a taxi driver, does not overly depend on his reputation and is free to have his own opinions. He would be merely robust compared to the artist who is anti-fragile. A mid-level bank employee with a mortgage would be fragile to the extreme. In fact, he would be completely a prisoner of the value system that invites him to be corrupt to the core, because of his dependence on the annual vacation in Barbados. The same with a civil servant in Washington. Take this easy-to-use heuristic, which is, to repeat the definition, a simple compressed rule of thumb, to detect the independence and robustness of someone's reputation. With few exceptions, those who dress outrageously are robust or even anti-fragile in reputation. Those clean-shaven types who dress in suits and ties are fragile to information about them. Large corporations and governments do not seem to understand this rebound power of information and its ability to control those who try to control it. When you hear a corporation or a debt-laden government trying to reinstill confidence, you know they are fragile, hence doomed. Information is merciless. One press conference to tranquilize and the investors will run away, causing a death spiral or a run on the bank. Which explains why I have an obsessive stance against government indebtedness as a staunch proponent of what is called fiscal conservatism. When you don't have debt, you don't care about your reputation in economic circles. And somehow it is only when you don't care about your reputation that you tend to have a good one. Just as in matters of seduction, people lend the most to those who need them the least. And we are blind to this anti-fragility of information in even more domains. If I physically beat up a rival in an ancestral environment, I injure him, weaken him, perhaps eliminate him forever, and get some exercise in the process. If I use the mob to put a contract on his head, he's gone. But if I stage a barrage of informational attacks on websites and in journals, I may be just helping him and hurting myself. So I end this section with a thought. It is quite perplexing to those from whom we have benefited the most aren't those who have tried to help us, say with advice, but rather those who have actively tried, but eventually failed to harm us. Next, we turn into a central distinction between the things that like stress and other things that don't. End of chapter 2.
Oh wow, is that the end of the chapter?
That's the end of the chapter. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, short chapter.
It's like a 12-page chapter.
Yes, little cakewalk action. I remember the first time we tried to do this. We tried to do 2 chapters in a session. That was just, and you and I were being way too long-winded with every stop that we had. It was crazy.
Yeah.
And now we're probably not stopping enough, so we'll kind of bring it back to the middle. But yeah, it was, that was an interesting last stretch there. In terms of the banned books thing is the thing that really gets me. Right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
A lot of leftists is like, I read banned books. Like, you don't. Shut the fuck up.
You read banned books? Okay, buddy.
Yeah, okay. You read banned books? Yeah.
Dr. Seuss books.
Yeah, it's just
You're
like,
reading right now.
Lenin and Karl Marx. I'm like, that's not banned. We live in an adjacent communistic society. We live in a closet communist society we have since like 1933. Fuck off. Right? There's only, what's really funny is that all these people like are saying like free market capitalism. Like it hasn't really been a thing since like the Gilded Age. And then things just absolutely boomed in that era. And
Yeah,
actually, I'm not entirely sure how this was the case. Letters from the Ruins, Thomas, he was the first to kind of point this out to me. I wasn't aware of this because I have the issue where I wasn't given the most classical education. My K through 8 was really intense, but it was really specific. And my high school was pretty good by today's standards. And there were certainly standards that got you ready for this day and age as American university, but it wasn't a classical education, right? You know, classical education means you're studying the great books, you Latin, Greek, proper econ, and that's less and less a thing, you know, in a post-Nuremberg era. So there are certain instances where I'm like, okay, I know a lot, and there's some instances where I know basically nothing, and really it's part of a general thing that most people should know. It's somewhat embarrassing. You know, I haven't read Virgil. In one case is the British Empire. Once upon a time, it was set up in such a way that the best people really bred, right? It's like if you're doing well, you're smart, you put out pretty solid output. You know, you had more money, you had more opportunities to breed, right? And you know, it's a very long, roundabout way of a form of eugenics, right? But it's not a malicious form of eugenics, right? It's just, you know, it is a meritocracy, right? It's no one's being thrown into gas chambers, right? So there's this guy, the Jolly Heretic. His name's Ed Dutton. He's written, you know, over 20 books. He's just on Jay Burton. He's talking about how you know, we are getting dumber as a species. I think that does have to do with technology. It's weird. It's like the highest, the people who are breeding are the highest IQ, the lowest IQ, the hyper religious, and immigrants. Right. So we're really speaking in respect of the West. Right. The skulls are getting smaller. The alleles for people who have PhDs are getting scarcer. Right. So PhD actually is apparently a genetic marker of your capacity to pursue concepts to such a degree that you present something that is new. That you present something that you know, when your PhD candidate gets approved, you know, you argue your dissertation, so on and so forth, right? That is becoming less and less the case in the West, and we can attribute that to World War I, you know, and the downfall since then. Not to beat a dead horse that I talk about every single freaking time, but why am I saying all this? Well, what I'm getting at is that is an era where you started to see something that was afflicted by communism. Right, and so at the time, what was a book that was sort of being stepped on in a lot of traditionalist circles back then was the Communist Manifesto. Right, so back then, in some instances, that was a banned book. It grew like wildfire. Right, I don't think there was ever an instance where Mein Kampf was really a banned book, but it was a controversial book. It was a polarizing book, and because of that, it attracted all this attention. So nowadays, you have people saying, you have people who have lived in this sort of adjacent communist society saying, "I read banned books." I'm like, no, you read a book that everyone reads. Like, you will not be faulted for saying you're communist out loud, right? If you read something remotely traditional, like you're reading Spengler, you can't find Spengler in a bookshop. You can't find Carlyle in a bookshop. You can't find Sorokin. Sorokin was written out of history, despite the fact that he served he taught at Harvard for a bit, right? That being said, eventually people start to get thrown into scenarios that ultimately are an inversion on what is sort of natural, what is not fragilista, what is not the Soviet Harvard elites, as he calls it. And out of nowhere, eventually, people sort of scramble, whether it's a minority or an eventual majority, and I think we are headed towards an eventual majority, where you find these books that are indeed banned. You're like, whoa, why were these banned? Why were a certain group of people burning books? Why did they, like, why is that banned information? Oh, because the books they were burning were about transgenderism and pedophilia back in the 1930s, which is obviously something that erodes a society. So we're getting to a point where you're seeing memes, um, the 2009 the 2009 Mountain Dew naming vote. The number one vote was Mustache Man. You can fill in the blanks. Did nothing wrong, right? So the more you suppress something, the more you ban it, the more it's going to gain attention, and it will eventually reach your critical mass. What's interesting is like you're actually better off sort of not giving it any attention at all, right? You're better off sort of minimizing it, containing it, and just label it as something boring, right?
Yeah.
You could.
Yeah.
There's a threshold. So he also says like the worst thing a book can be is not controversial. The worst thing a book can be is boring, right? There are books that are like hilariously bad. I've read some, right? To me, I wouldn't necessarily say it is legitimately a hilariously bad book. But in terms of why I thought it was bad was The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. I was like,
yeah.
Classic.
I was like, this book
The
is
high
so
school
bad.
English class classic.
Yeah.
That book was hard to read.
That Ethan Frome, horrible, hated it. I was like, this is whack.
And then there was a book when we were doing Harlem Renaissance, like my freshman year. They had a list of books to choose from. I picked one called Boot Boy. It wasn't even as bad. It was just boring. The prose is actually good. The sentence structure was good, but the plot was actually interesting. But somehow, despite all those things, it didn't come together to create something that was actually entertaining to read. It was just dry. It was like saltine cracker dry. Right, so it's better to sort of like be outright bad than to be like watching bad movies is better than watching boring movies, right? Like watching Sharknado 3 that is hilarious, right? Because it's the antithesis of the way a movie should go. And then
I told you that I stayed up late last night hanging out with my college roommates, right? So half of them were gay. So half of them were playing euchre. The other half were just chilling. And on the TV, we were watching. Apparently, I was not involved in the decision-making process of this because I was in my room. And I came out to see 50 Shades of Black on the TV, which is a rom-com spoof of 50 Shades of Grey. But it has, black people as, like, that's the spoof, is that it has modern black culture like embedded into it. And I think the comedian's name is Marlon Webb, I think. But he
Sorry, carry on. Can you hear me? Ben, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's just Jacob. Maybe Jacob is indeed the problem. Like it's a
problem.
Yeah.
Oh, there he is. Yeah, okay, the problem's back. Carry on.
Can you hear me now?
Marlon Webb.
Did you lose me?
Marlon Webb.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
We did. Oh, Jacob.
Keeps cutting out.
Hey, so.
Mine too, though. So.
Okay, yeah, so it's definitely not us. He is the problem.
I think it may have been my headphones. I'm just turning them off.
Okay, so the headphones are the problem. Carry on.
So anyway, 50 Shades.
Oh.
It was not the neatest headphones. Jake, please. All right, Ben, you're up. What are your closing thoughts on the entire chapter? Still Jake.
I mean, I thought everything we went over today was pretty interesting. I like the It's interesting considering that like something being controversial, it can like make it being anti-fragile in the first place. Like just connecting those two as things I didn't really think would be here. I mean, like I said, this is my first time going through it, so seeing the source text and like all the examples and stuff is interesting. Just building the idea that I've only had based on things that you've said versus like going super in depth into it.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, remember that chick Little Red 6 years ago, right? Who was on Dr. Phil, and instead of like sort of submitting to the wisdom's a stretch for Dr. Phil, but sort of the anecdote, the sort of the platitudes rather that Dr. Phil was peddling. She just doubles down on being a brat and says, "Cash me outside." How about that? And I'm like,
Yes,
Oh, yeah,
I
that
remember
girl.
that.
bro, we
Forgot
heard
about
about
that.
for months, right? And you thought that was it, and then she comes out with like a diss track with David Spade, that guy who insulted her, and then he's like, "Actually, you know what? Never mind." And then she had some semblance of a music career. Now she's 18 and has OnlyFans, right? Okay, so obviously we're very like anti all of that, right? But that being said, it's like the controversy. You keep stirring up controversy, keeps gaining attention. Attention these days has money because the advertising is tied to attention, right? So basically, whether you're like the highest virtue or the worst, or like the lowest, sort of scum, if you can make noise about it, you're actually going to generate revenue. That in itself is like anti-fragile because it will indeed gain attention, which is really sad, right? That's kind of what Twitter is right now. Twitter is just the most anti-fragile poster, whether in terms of value or in terms of controversy, right? So it's like good and the greatest extreme of good is getting attention. The greatest extreme of bad is definitely getting attention, and then probably banned. So
True.
it's kind of an unfortunate aspect of life because you kind of don't want to be a sellout. In some ways, like I know there are ways that I could attract more attention to anti-fragile athletes by being what would make me feel like a sellout. It's not necessarily actually is a sellout, right? But that's not really something I'm willing to do. Sort of lean into gimmicks, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me all right now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Carry on.
I need to round up all the thoughts that I had that apparently you guys weren't hearing. So, the 50 Shades of Black movie was comedically bad, like you said about some books that you've read, Arthur, but it wasn't boring. On the subject of banned books, how you were talking about them, I remembered a similar thing about how it would be better to just not ban it and not give it the attention is the drinking culture in the USA. So it's very popular to drink underage in the United States, while the drinking age is 21 years old. So it's like, kids drinking, it's, going against the authority. And then once you turn 21, it loses, like drinking loses some of its charm in that regard. It's no longer like something that you're not supposed to do anymore. So the next logical step up from that is drinking and driving, because that's also illegal. And that can end very poorly. Versus
Next logical step. That's hilarious.
the next logical step up of doing something illegal, since alcohol is no longer illegal, is to drink alcohol and then drive, which is illegal. You just gotta, it brings that sense of like, brings your adrenaline back. But versus Europe, where in places like Germany, you can drink as young as 14 years old if you're like in your house and your parents are home, and you can drink in Europe. And their drinking culture is not nearly as problematic, and alcoholism is everywhere, but it's a much more like culturally normal and healthy drinking culture over there versus the United States.
Yeah, it's interesting, like what constitutes something being a healthy, like which things have a healthy relationship with quote unquote, like, oh, you don't make it that big a deal, then it's fine, like but then there are things that you basically just need an outright ban on it. That's the only way of keeping them down.
Yeah.
Like,
It
you're not gonna
depends
ban-
on the activity itself, and then from there, it also depends on the individual's circumstances and thought processes. So it's hard to make a generalized case for anything.
Yeah, how do I put this? I forgot. I'm not even gonna pretend to pull something out. I just genuinely forgot for the first time. I can't believe it. I forgot for the first time. Can't believe you're telling me that. Yeah. No. What's interesting in terms of actually the example I was going to use was in the United States they have 400 million independently owned guns. Good fucking luck to you trying to ban guns there.
Yeah.
And every time they even try to remotely move towards banning guns, there's even more legislature that sort of protects it. And then they make ghost guns with 3D printers.
Everyone's just going to lose all their guns in a boating accident. Like there are people there are companies that make T-shirts that say that. I lost all my guns in a boating accident. It's just not going to happen.
No. You're not going to Hillary Clinton yourself like not having guns in that country.
Talking about them. No, I saw something the other thought. They're just like, it's like, why? It's like
talking in the background.
My bad.
Background. Oh.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, that one definitely wasn't me. That was too close.
It sounded loud. Anyway.
Yeah. No. The shorter chapter this time around. It's a good one though.
It was good.
I think this is more compressed points. This book really does read like the more I read it, it reads like it reads like just a really sophisticated rant.
It does.
It's like he's just the right. Not to be a bit crass about this, but he has just the right amount of alcohol in him. He's sort of like he's reached a pinnacle of being disenfranchised with the system, but also too enamored with it to not mess with it. To not criticize it the entire time. And it's like, you know what? A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. Oh, do you want to hear it again? Okay, here's 17 other different ways to go through the alphabet. Like, it's just, it has, like, I don't want to call it smug because it isn't, but it is, like, just dismissive of everything he's presenting, even though he's presenting it. If that makes sense.
It sounds like you're listening to your friend rant at 3 a.m. Like, it sounds like many conversations that I've had at 3 a.m. in college of people just, like, spouting their, generated ideals or, like, ideas that they've came up with over the course of their life, even though they're in their early 20s. And it's just but obviously, Taleb is not in his early 20s and he has lived life, but it is very much ranty. And it's an enjoyable thing to listen to because it doesn't get boring like a textbook. And it also doesn't get boring like an essay where it's not a systematic argument that he's presenting. He's bouncing all around, which keeps it interesting.
Yeah, it does. It does. The what I sometimes sort of struggle with Nassim Taleb, it's like almost like it's too cynical. If that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't be this sort of weary of anything that's sort of established and not fluid. That's the only thing where I think I sort of struggle with this text, but it is a text that I try to live by. I think, too, in the case of Taleb, he's a victim of his own sarcasm. He's like, you guys didn't get my book with the whole COVID vaccine. Be fragile. Like, he even makes the case in this book for just sort of natural immunity, and then he, like, hardline on COVID. It's like, I don't even necessarily think it's like he lost track of his ideal. I think he just distorted his own ideal in his head because his head can naturally do that. Right? There's an idea out there that I think is true. Being more intelligent doesn't necessarily be you're going to be more effective. Being more intelligent just really increases your capacity for self-deception. and I've fallen victim of this myself, and I've seen it in my dad too. He's like the smartest guy ever. When he's focused and not self-deceiving, he's unstoppable. But he's self-deceiving a lot. He kind of ensnared in some high-power thoughts that I don't really want to let go of you, and I think he felt victim of that. So.
Yeah, it's the self-reliant, rational mind where things have to be thought out and proven and have to have a logical train of thought to make sense, versus the faithful mind. My spiritual father recently recommended I read My Life in Christ by St. John of Kronstadt, and it's just like thoughts that it's a collection of thoughts that he's had while praying or contemplating, and it's really good. And one of them contains, I'll quote it here: "The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life, said the Lord. The writings of the Holy Fathers are again the expression of the mind, word, and spirit of the Holy Trinity, in which the spirit of a higher class, spiritually speaking, of mankind is largely participated. The writings of ordinary worldly men are the expression of the fallen spirit of men with all their sinful attachments, habits, and passions. In the Holy Scriptures we see God face to face and ourselves as we are. Man, know thyself through them, and walk always as in the presence of God." So as we're reading Antifragile, or even the Book of Five Rings, or even any other fantastic piece of literature that might be written by someone, it's still good to take into account that there are, people, men and women, wrote these books. And you need to remember that any deficiencies in the message of the book are deficiencies that are being painted on the canvas of the story of the book by whoever was writing the book. So it's just good to keep that awareness while reading anything.
Yeah, you have to have. I mean, that goes for even the Bible.
Yeah.
Sorry, Protestants out there, but I had to. But anywho, any closing thoughts, gentlemen?
I think I don't have anything else to add, but I think today I really enjoyed this chapter. It was entertaining.
What up, man?
Yeah. I also don't have much else to add.
All right, guys. Well, if nothing else, for listeners, check out Antifragile Athletes if you're looking for a tailored training at an elite level with the community of elite level athletes. Jacob is a jiu-jitsu athlete. Ben Green is a college wrestler. Myself, I'm a Muay Thai fighter. We have people attempting special operations selection. We have bodybuilders, powerlifters, so on and so forth. Check us out at anti.fragile.athletes on Instagram. We'll have a website this month as well. Nothing else. God bless. Happy trading. Over now.